In September of 2020, Supergiant Games released their seminal roguelike action title Minos to universal critical acclaim. Minos follows the adventures of Theseus, the ancient Greek hero, as he traverses the maze of Daedalus before eventually earning his final escape by slaying the terrible Minotaur, a beast both man and bull. Now, those of you familiar with Supergiant Games' catalog might be confused by the history I just described. A quick Google search will reveal that there is no Minos released by Supergiant Games, and if you look at the release date of 2020 in the company's publishing history, there's an entirely different title sitting in that window called Hades. Hades is a game also set in the rich backdrop of Greek mythology, but features as its protagonist Zagreus, the son of the underworld's king Hades, attempting to escape his father by fighting through the shifting halls of the dead until eventually confronting Hades himself as the final obstacle before stepping out onto the surface of the world. So, why did I tell that story about Minos if the game never existed? The answer is that Minos is the name originally given to the project that would eventually become Hades. It began by following the exploits of Theseus, not Zagreus, in a totally different setting with different goals and stakes for the main character. Minos is the game we would have gotten if the team hadn't chosen to radically shift the direction of its story partway through development. This kind of transformation is common when making games. In fact, it's more usual than not in practically every art form. A couple of years ago, I started writing a story and poetry with a simple prompt, that a man would scale a mountain to speak with a famous oracle, who would offer him the answer to a single question. Then he would use his question to ask her to marry him, surprising the oracle, and because he loved the oracle more than the knowledge he might get from her, she then answered his questions for the rest of his life. After I began, however, I discovered that the basic premise wanted to be something more elaborate than I had anticipated, and the end result is a sweeping narrative including betrayal, violence, heartbreak, and redemption. So, why? Why do stories often require transformation in order to properly flourish? Why is it so rare for an idea that seems compelling in our minds to translate immediately in the way we expect into our artistic projects? I think there are numerous good answers to this question, but a convenient one I'd like to reach for is the example of the roguelike genre itself. Whether you're getting shot at by a post-apocalyptic mutant in Nuclear Throne, or stumbling just before reaching the final boss in One Step from Eden, the cycle of failure that loops you back to try again with new strategies in these games is a pretty good analog for the artistic process. The reason that creating art is such a fickle process, whether it be a story or music or a video game, is that the conceit we invent in our minds about what should exist only survives until it's tested against the real world. Everything about your Sonic the Hedgehog fanfiction might seem coherent in your head, but it's a sorry awakening when you share the details with your YouTube video essay watching buddy who immediately shatters the core plot by pointing out that Knuckles getting a PhD in chemical engineering is radically out of character. The simple truth that our minds are not a complete map of what comes together harmoniously when put to page or programmed into a game is one of the most important lessons when pursuing an artistic discipline. It doesn't matter how cool the idea in your head is. Until you've prototyped it out, you just don't know whether it works. Just like you need to repeat your run after reaching 0 health points in Slay the Spire, returning to attempt a different combination of cards in your deck, as a creator, you also need to be willing to scale your project's vision back in favor of experimenting with new ideas and innovating on what you've already done. I've thrown out about 80% of what I had for Blossom's story 2 separate times. My first idea for the game's narrative was that the protagonist is a kaiju slayer, basically someone who hunts shape-shifting demons, locked in ever-changing fantasy woods until he can find and slay the mastermind demon holding his victims captive. I had side characters fleshed out, branching paths for how the story could change depending on the choices you made during your runs, but in the end I just canned it. Having a villain who is all evil all the time didn't feel compelling, and there were some changing game design considerations that I had to work with as the programming needs for the project began to shift. My second idea was similar, but a more intimate and character-driven story where the protagonist is not a kaiju slayer, but instead a young man who was raised by the slayers, going into the forest to avenge his dead brother. I even built a flashback system that would drip feed the player bits of backstory every time they lost. And while I may still include this mechanic, when I tried it out with some testers in its current form, they mostly just ignored it, which, in hindsight, I can understand. The players are thinking tactically about choices they need to make to advance through a strategy game, and so suddenly hitting them with an intimate, emotional reflection while they're in that headspace, coupled with the frustration of having lost their run, it's just not compatible. So, I'm back to the drawing board. Right now I'm thinking about changing my setting to an earlier time in the fictional world that I've set Blossom in. Something more mythological and abstract, whose less introspective tone might be a better fit for the union of pragmatic problem solving and poetic language that I'm attempting with Blossom. Will this end up being the story that ships with the final game? Who knows? I'll try my best this run, and we'll see how long it takes me to run out of hit points. Thanks so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel for future updates if you want to, but either way, have a great day.